On the evening of 19th August 1892, in the drawing room of Marble House on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, Alva Vanderbilt adjusted a single spray of white roses in a Sèvres vase. Outside, carriages grind over gravel, harness bells chiming against the distant rush of the Atlantic. Inside, candlelight floats across gilded panels and 500,000 cubic feet of marble, a house her husband has given her as a 39th birthday gift, at a reported cost of $11 million, most of it spent on stone. A society columnist from the New York World has already called her earlier Fifth Avenue ball a social revolution, and tonight's Newport Cottage is its marble sequel. On a side table lies a calling card from Mrs. Astor, the woman who once excluded her from the 400. Alva's gloved fingers hesitate over the roses. Too high, too low, too obvious. The flowers are gracious, but the message is not. This is hospitality arranged as a strategy. When the guests arrive, they will speak of opulence. The house itself will speak of something colder, a woman who has learned to weaponize beauty. On 17 January 1853, in the humid port city of Mobile, Alabama, Alva Erskine Smith was born into the prosperous household of Murray Forbes Smith and Phoebe Ann Desha Smith. Her father's wealth derives from cotton trading, that peculiarly Southern prosperity built on plantation agriculture and the enslaved labor that sustained it. The Smith family occupies a comfortable position in Mobile's antebellum society, moving among merchants and planters whose fortunes rise and fall with cotton prices and political winds. The Civil War shatters this world. When Alva is still a child, the conflict destroys not only the Confederacy, but the economic system that supported families like the Smiths. Her father's business collapses as cotton markets vanish and Southern currency becomes worthless. What had seemed like permanent prosperity reveals itself as fragile, dependent on a system that has ended in blood and defeat. In the years immediately following the war, as Mobile struggles with occupation, poverty, and the social upheaval of Reconstruction, the Smith family makes a decision common among displaced Southern elites. They leave. First, they move north to New York, joining other Southern refugees seeking to rebuild fortunes in northern cities where capital and opportunity still exist. But Murray Smith's financial situation remains precarious, and by the late 1860s, the family makes a more dramatic move to Paris, joining the community of American expatriates who find life in France both cheaper and more socially forgiving than life in the United States. For young Alva, these years in France become formative. She attends French schools, institutions that emphasize not just academic subjects, but the elaborate codes of deportment, language, and social grace that define European respectability. She learns to speak French fluently, to play piano with technical competence, if not artistry, to carry herself with the erect posture and controlled movement that mark a properly educated jeune fille. The curriculum includes literature, history, and the arts, but always within a framework that assumes education's purpose is to prepare young women for advantageous marriages and respectable social positions. Yet even as a child, Alva demonstrates resistance to the passive femininity these schools attempt to cultivate. In later life, she will recall herself as having been a horrible child, someone who beat boys who mocked her for being a girl. Behavior that resulted in punishment, but that she remembered with a certain pride, as evidence that even then she understood gender as a contest rather than a natural hierarchy. The story, whether entirely accurate or partly reconstructed, reveals something essential about how Alva understood herself, as someone who fought back, who refused to accept limitations quietly, who saw rules as obstacles to overcome rather than natural laws to obey. Archival traces from these years, school records, ship manifests showing the family's movements between New York and France, scattered family correspondence, reveal a girl being moved like luggage across the Atlantic. Her education and location determined by her father's financial struggles and her family's attempts to maintain respectability, despite diminished circumstances. Yet these same documents show her steadily absorbing the codes and performances of European high society, learning the languages and manners that will later allow her to move confidently, among the American wealthy who aspire to European sophistication. The narrator observes that for Alva, the world seems wide: Mobile, New York, Paris, Newport still decades in her future, but the path chosen for her remains narrow, defined by the assumption that a woman's destiny lies in marriage and that her education should prepare her to attract and please a wealthy husband. The constraint is gilded by French, Polish, and Parisian sophistication, but it remains constraint. She is being shaped into a commodity for the marriage market, her intelligence and force of will channeled toward the goal of securing a prosperous match. Before Alva learns to arrange flowers in the grand houses of the Gilded Age, she learns to arrange herself, to present the appearance of docility and grace, while protecting a harder, more ambitious core that her education is designed to soften, but never quite succeeds in eliminating. On 20th of April 1875, at Calvary Church in New York City, Alva Erskine Smith married William Kissam Vanderbilt in a ceremony that marked her successful navigation of the marriage market. Her education prepared her to enter. The groom, known as Willie K. to family and friends, is a grandson of the late Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore whose steamship and railroad empire made the Vanderbilt name synonymous with American wealth. Willie K. has inherited a substantial fortune, though not the largest portion of the Commodore's estate. That went to his father, William Henry Vanderbilt, making Willie K. wealthy but not the head of the family dynasty. The match has been facilitated by Alva's friend Consuelo Iznaga, herself an American who has successfully married into the British aristocracy by wedding Viscount Mandeville. The introduction at a Vanderbilt gathering leads to courtship and, relatively quickly, to marriage. For Alva, still in her early 20s and acutely aware of her family's reduced circumstances after the war, the marriage represents security, restoration of the prosperity she knew in childhood, and entrance into the highest circles of American society, or at least its wealthiest circles, which are not quite the same thing. Later anecdotes, impossible to verify but widely repeated, and perhaps apocryphal but psychologically revealing, attribute to Alva a private maxim that captures her approach to marriage: first marry for money, then marry for love. Whether she actually articulated this philosophy before her marriage to Willie K., or whether it represents her later rationalization of choices made, the sentiment reflects a clear-eyed pragmatism about matrimony as economic transaction. She understands what many of her contemporaries understand but rarely state so bluntly, that for women of her class and era, marriage is the primary, often the only, means of securing financial stability and social position. The wedding itself is reported in society columns that emphasize the scale and opulence of the celebration, the impressive roster of Vanderbilt family members in attendance, and the obvious wealth the marriage represents. The accounts mark Alva's transition from the daughter of a financially troubled Southern family to the wife of one of America's richest men, a transformation achieved through careful education, strategic friendship, and the marriage market's cold calculus. In the years immediately following the wedding, Willie K. and Alva established themselves in New York society. Ledgers from the estate of William Henry Vanderbilt show generous financial provisions for the young couple: houses, allowances, the resources necessary to live in the style expected of the Vanderbilt name. Alva begins receiving calling cards from families eager to cultivate connections with Vanderbilt wealth, though notably not from Mrs. William Backhouse Astor Jr., the Caroline Astor who reigns as the undisputed queen of New York's highest society. The exclusion is not personal but structural. The Vanderbilts, despite their staggering wealth, remain new money in a city where social supremacy belongs to families whose fortunes are older and whose names carry the patina of generations. Mrs. Astor's famous 400, supposedly the number of people who could fit comfortably in her ballroom, but actually a symbolic designation of New York's social elite, does not include the Vanderbilts, whose railroad and steamship millions are too recently acquired, too openly commercial, too aggressively displayed to qualify as truly refined. For Alva, this exclusion rankles. She has married into wealth. Now she wants the social position that wealth should command. In the drawing rooms of her New York homes, she begins practicing another ritual that will become characteristic: arranging flowers in parlors and dining rooms, positioning roses and lilies beneath family portraits and expensive paintings, creating visual arguments through domestic aesthetics that she belongs in the highest circles, that Vanderbilt money deserves Astor recognition. The narrator reflects that in Gilded Age New York, marriage for women of Alva's class is not escape from constraint, but its formalization, a legal and social arrangement that trades one form of dependency on parents and male relatives for another on a husband, while offering in return financial security and the possibility of social power. Alva has secured the fortune through her marriage to Willie Kay. Now she begins planning how to capture the throne of social supremacy that remains just beyond her reach. By March 1883, Alva presided over a newly completed monument to Vanderbilt ambition, the Petit Chateau at 1660 Fifth Avenue, a French Renaissance palace designed by architect Richard Morris Hunt as both family residence and architectural manifesto. The house, occupying an entire city block, is built of limestone and decorated with elaborate carvings, its facade deliberately evoking the great houses of the Loire Valley and the urban palaces of Paris. Inside, the rooms feature carved wood paneling, marble fireplaces, and elaborate plasterwork, a level of European-inspired grandeur unprecedented in New York domestic architecture. The house is not merely a home, but a weapon in Alva's campaign for social recognition. She understands that in a city where older families jealously guard their social preeminence, architecture can accomplish what mere wealth cannot. If she builds a house more magnificent than those of the Astors and the other old families, if she creates spaces so spectacular that they cannot be ignored, she can force recognition through the sheer overwhelming fact of superior display. On the evening of 26th March 1883, Alva deployed this weapon with devastating effect. She hosts a masquerade ball that contemporary newspaper accounts describe as costing more than $250,000, an almost incomprehensible sum for a single evening's entertainment. Invitations are sent to approximately 1,200 guests, each one carefully chosen to advance Alva's social objectives. The costumes required by the masquerade theme give the evening an air of theatricality and fantasy, transforming the Petit Chateau into a stage where American wealth performs its own vision of European aristocratic splendor. The Museum of the City of New York preserves photographs and press coverage documenting the evening. Guests arriving in costumes representing historical periods and exotic locations, the house blazing with gaslight and candles, tables laden with elaborate food and wine, orchestras playing in multiple rooms, decorations that transform the interior into a fantasy landscape of gilded excess. The spectacle is calculated to overwhelm, to demonstrate that Vanderbilt wealth can create experiences more magnificent than anything New York society has previously witnessed. But the ball's most significant moment occurs before the event itself, in the weeks of preparation leading up to that March evening. Alva initially withholds an invitation from Caroline Astor, the social arbiter whose recognition she most desires. Mrs. Astor's daughter Carrie desperately wants to attend. The ball has become the most anticipated event of the season, and exclusion would be humiliating. Finally, following the rules of social etiquette that require a calling card before an invitation can be sent, Mrs. Astor herself is forced to leave her card at the Vanderbilt house, an act of formal recognition that Alva has been seeking, an acknowledgement that the Vanderbilts cannot be excluded from the highest social circles. Only after receiving Mrs. Astor's card does Alva send the invitation to the Astor women, allowing them to attend the ball and thereby making the evening a social triumph not just of display but of strategic victory. The woman who had been excluded from the 400 has forced New York's social queen to come to her, to acknowledge her, to participate in an event staged in a Vanderbilt house. On the morning of the ball, while servants make final preparations and florists deliver massive arrangements of roses, orchids, and exotic plants, Alva walks slowly through the grand salons of the Petit Chateau. She adjusts floral garlands draped over doorways, repositions table arrangements to ensure optimal visual effect, examine sightlines and lighting to guarantee that every guest will be properly impressed. The house has become a stage from which she will reorder New York's social map, and every detail must be perfect. The narrator observes that etiquette books of the era called this entertaining, framing lavish hospitality as a gracious duty of wealthy women. Alva uses the same rituals and customs as a form of siege warfare, deploying flowers and food and music as weapons in a campaign to break down social barriers that had excluded her. The constraint of gender, women's power limited to domestic and social realms, becomes in her hands a tool for accumulating real influence, for forcing recognition from those who had refused it. By dawn on 27 March 1883, Mrs. Astor entered the Vanderbilt house, danced in its ballroom, acknowledged its magnificence. Alva has crossed the invisible line that separates new money from social acceptance. The battle is not entirely won. Full equality with the oldest families will take years more maneuvering, but a decisive victory has been achieved through careful planning, overwhelming display, and ruthless strategic thinking disguised as gracious hospitality on a typical winter morning in January 1886 at the Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue. The sounds filtering through the house are domestic, yet orchestrated with almost military precision. A governess instructing young Consuelo Vanderbilt in French verb conjugations in a second-floor schoolroom. A music master guiding her through piano scales in the music room. A dancing teacher correcting posture and carriage in the mirrored ballroom where just 3 years earlier 1,000 guests had celebrated Alva's social triumph. Alva oversees this educational regime personally, treating her daughter's cultivation with the same strategic intensity she brought to her campaign for social recognition. Her own French schooling and years living abroad in Paris have given her clear ideas about what proper education for a girl of her class should encompass: fluency in French and German, accomplished piano playing, if not professional level mastery, graceful dancing, and perfect deportment, the ability to converse intelligently about art and literature without displaying unfeminine pedantry, and above all, the refined manners and instinctive social awareness that will mark Consuelo as someone worthy of the most advantageous marriage alliances. The curriculum is not unique to the Vanderbilt household. Wealthy families across New York employ similar programs of tutors and lessons designed to prepare daughters for their roles as ornamental wives and sophisticated hostesses. But Alva's approach carries an intensity and purposefulness that reflects her own ambitions. She understands that Consuelo, as a Vanderbilt heiress with one of the largest fortunes in America behind her, represents an extraordinary asset on the marriage market. Properly cultivated, the girl could secure not just a wealthy American husband, but potentially a European title, linking the Vanderbilt name to ancient aristocratic lineages in a way that would complete Alva's social ascent. Household accounts preserved in various archives show regular payments to French and German governesses, music teachers, dancing masters, and art instructors. School records and later biographical accounts document the hours Consuelo spends at lessons, the languages she masters, the accomplishments she acquires. But these archival traces tell us little about the emotional cost of this education. The pressure a young girl experiences under her mother's exacting standards and relentless oversight. That emotional reality emerges most clearly in Consuelo's own later memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, where she recalls her mother's approach to her upbringing with a mixture of respect and resentment. She remembers Alva's insistence that even her bedroom at Marble House, the Newport Palace not yet built in 1886 but which will become the setting for much of Consuelo's later adolescence, would be designed to forbid the intrusion of her personal possessions, transforming what should be private refuge into curated display space, where every object and arrangement reflects Alva's aesthetic vision rather than Consuelo's personal preferences. The comment, made years after childhood, reveals the fundamental tension in Consuelo's upbringing. She is being educated not to become herself, but to become what Alva has determined she should be: a perfectly refined product designed for strategic deployment through marriage. Her own desires, preferences, and emerging sense of self are systematically subordinated to her mother's vision of what a Vanderbilt daughter should represent. On winter afternoons when lessons are complete, Alva sometimes walks through the house with Consuelo, pointing out paintings and sculptures, explaining why certain arrangements of furniture and objects create pleasing effects, teaching her daughter the same aesthetic awareness and strategic thinking about domestic spaces that Alva has used to such effect in her social campaigns. The walks are educational, but they are also displays of power. Alva showing Consuelo the world she has created through ambition and determination, implicitly teaching the lesson that a woman with sufficient will can shape her environment and the people within it to serve her purposes. The narrator reflects that refinement in the Vanderbilt household is not simply protection against the rough edges of industrial wealth, nor merely the cultivation of beauty and grace for their own sake. It is preparation for deployment, the systematic transformation of a child into an asset that can be strategically married to serve family ambition. Every French verb Consuelo memorizes, every piano piece she masters, every graceful curtsy she perfects under the dancing master's instruction is part of her preparation for a future that has already been imagined and planned, though not yet openly discussed. While other wealthy children may play with relative freedom, understanding their education as preparation for adult life, but not yet feeling the full weight of parental expectation, Consuelo is already learning what it means to be a Vanderbilt daughter in a household where her mother treats social position as territory to be conquered and children as instruments of conquest. The grace she is acquiring carries weight that she is only beginning to understand, a burden that will grow heavier as Alva's plans for her future become more explicit. By the summer of 1888, the Vanderbilt family's seasonal migration to Newport, Rhode Island, had become an established pattern, where earlier generations of wealthy New Yorkers built relatively modest wooden cottages along Newport's ocean front. The newest generation is beginning to construct something far more ambitious, massive stone palaces designed to rival European estates, transforming the small resort town into an American showcase of architectural magnificence and competitive display. For Alva, Newport represents a new theater of operations. At the family's existing Newport property, Idle Hour, and visiting the cottages of other wealthy families along Bellevue Avenue and Ocean Drive, she studies how older money and more established families organize their summer lives. She observes who sits where at dinner parties, which verandas and terraces host which guests for afternoon tea, how the physical arrangement of houses and gardens shapes social interactions and hierarchies. Newport's compressed season, roughly July through September, creates intense social dynamics, with dozens of wealthy families entertaining constantly, and Alva recognizes the opportunity this presents. That summer of 1888, she made a decision that would produce her greatest architectural triumph. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who designed the Petit Chateau, to create a new Newport cottage for the Vanderbilt family. The design Hunt develops draws inspiration from the Petit Trianon at Versailles, with additional elements from other French classical sources. The house will be built almost entirely of marble, not just marble facings or decorative elements, but massive structural marble, creating a palace of stone that will dwarf everything else in Newport and establish the Vanderbilts as the leaders of the summer colony's building boom. Preservation Society of Newport County Archives document the scale of Hunt's commission. Plans for a house requiring 4 years of construction, 1888-1892, approximately 500,000 cubic feet of marble, dozens of craftsmen and artisans brought from Europe to execute specialized work, and a total cost that contemporary accounts estimate at $11 million, with $7 million of that spent on marble alone. The budget represents wealth deployed not for comfort or utility, but for effect, for the creation of a structure so magnificent that it cannot be ignored or dismissed. Throughout the construction period, Alva visits the building site regularly, sometimes several times a week during the summer season, when she is in residence at Idle Hour. She walks through the unfinished rooms with Hunt and the project foreman, discussing every detail. The exact shade of gold leaf for the ballroom ceiling, the proper arrangement of the massive marble columns in the entrance hall, the sight lines from various rooms to ensure that every space serves both aesthetic and social purposes. On quiet afternoons when construction crews are absent or working in distant parts of the growing structure, Alva stands alone in the unfinished gold ballroom or on the terraces overlooking the ocean, imagining how these spaces will function when filled with guests. She visualizes where furniture will be placed, how flower arrangements will frame views and direct attention, which rooms will host intimate conversations, and which will stage more public performances. The house is being built of marble and crafted by artisans, but it is also being lined with Alva's intentions. Every room designed not just as living space, but as a theater for social action. Contemporary observers and later architectural historians note the boldness of Marble House's design, its unapologetic grandeur, and its deliberate evocation of European royal palaces. The house makes no pretense of being a casual summer retreat or even a comfortable family home. It is a statement building, architecture as argument, claiming for its owner a position of social supremacy backed by overwhelming material display. The narrator observes that while the house is ostensibly being built for family use, a summer cottage where the Vanderbilts will escape New York's heat and enjoy Newport's ocean breezes, its true purpose is strategic. Marble House is a weapon in Alva's continuing campaign to cement her social position, to intimidate rivals, and to create a setting worthy of the European aristocratic connections she is beginning to envision for her daughter. Before the first guest arrives for a tea or dinner party, before a single flower arrangement graces its marble surfaces, Marble House is already working, transforming the Newport landscape, establishing new standards of architectural magnificence, and announcing that Alva Vanderbilt intends not merely to participate in Newport society, but to dominate it. The house that will open in August 1892 is being designed in 1888-1891, built stone by stone and detail by detail, but its impact is already being felt through the anticipation it creates, the architectural competition it sparks among other wealthy families scrambling to keep pace, and the social dynamics it begins to reshape even before completion. The marble being quarried and shipped to Newport carries Alva's ambitions in its very mass, stone made into strategy, beauty weaponized. On a damp November morning in 1893, in the library of the Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue, Consuelo Vanderbilt sits at a mahogany writing desk in a stiff-backed chair while her mother dictates correspondence. The ritual has become daily: letters of thanks for hospitality received, polite notes declining invitations to events Alva has deemed inappropriate or insufficiently prestigious, carefully worded responses to inquiries from families seeking to arrange introductions or cultivate connections with the Vanderbilts. Consuelo's hand, cramping from the unfamiliar adult penmanship required by these formal letters, moves across heavy cream-colored stationery, embossed with the Vanderbilt crest. Each letter must be perfect. No corrections, no crossed-out words, the flowing script maintaining elegance, even as her fingers tire. Alva stands behind her or paces slowly across the Turkish carpet, dictating phrases with precision, occasionally leaning over to examine Consuelo's penmanship and pointing out letters that need better formation or spacing that seems uneven. The exercise is ostensibly about teaching Consuelo the social correspondence skills she will need as an adult. Woman of her class, the ability to manage complex social obligations through carefully calibrated written communication. But it is also about something deeper: the imposition of control, the subordination of Consuelo's will to her mother's direction, the daily reinforcement that Alva's judgment governs every aspect of her daughter's life, including how she expresses herself in writing. Alva's own correspondence from this period, preserved in various archival collections, including papers at Vanderbilt University and in Preservation Society records, shows a woman who has become extraordinarily skilled at using written communication as a tool of social management. Her letters arrange European introductions for the family's increasingly frequent continental travels, coordinate with architects and decorators about ongoing projects at Marble House and other properties, manage Newport social calendars with strategic precision, and cultivate relationships with European aristocrats who might eventually figure in Consuelo's marital future. Every letter advances multiple objectives simultaneously, with apparently casual social notes containing carefully embedded messages about status, expectations, and alliances. Consuelo is being trained to replicate this skill, to transform social correspondence from mere politeness into strategic action. But she is being trained through dictation rather than through development of her own voice, learning to write letters that express Alva's thoughts and serve Alva's purposes rather than learning to articulate her own views or pursue her own social objectives. In her later memoir, written decades after these library sessions, Consuelo recalls this period of her adolescence with particular bitterness. She describes being fitted with steel braces designed to correct her posture, devices strapped to her back that forced her spine into rigid uprightness, making it painful to slouch or bend, training her body to maintain the perfectly erect carriage that Alva considered essential for a future duchess. The braces were worn for hours during lessons and even during sleep, creating constant physical discomfort that Consuelo was expected to endure without complaint as the necessary price of achieving the graceful posture that would make her attractive to European aristocratic suitors. She also recalls the way Marble House in Newport was arranged during these years, with even her own bedroom designed more as a display space than as a private refuge. Furniture was selected for aesthetic effect rather than comfort. Decorative objects were positioned to create pleasing visual compositions that reflected Alva's taste rather than Consuelo's preferences, and the girls' few personal possessions were relegated to cabinets and drawers where they would not disrupt the room's carefully curated appearance. The message was clear, even in what should have been her most private space. Consuelo existed primarily as an element in her mother's aesthetic and social vision, her own desires and comfort secondary to the image being projected. The narrator reflects that for daughters of Gilded Age wealth, education often meant learning which parts of oneself must never appear in public, and increasingly, must not even exist in private. Consuelo is being systematically trained to suppress spontaneity, to subordinate preference to propriety, to understand that her value lies not in authentic selfhood, but in perfectly performed elegance. Every letter written in her mother's voice rather than her own, every hour spent in the steel posture, brace, every personal object banished from view, teaches the same lesson. She is being shaped into something her mother can use, not encouraged to become someone she might choose to be. As Consuelo's handwriting on the formal stationery becomes more fluid and elegant, as her posture becomes habitually erect without need for the steel braces, as she learns to move through Marble House's grand rooms with unconscious grace, the education is succeeding in its explicit purposes. But it is also creating something Alva may not fully recognize: a young woman who understands that her life has been designed by others, that the future being prepared for her has been determined without her consent, and that the more perfect her performance becomes, the more completely her own desires and choices are being erased. On the afternoon of 26th of March, 1895, as unseasonably cold rain falls on Manhattan and news of Alva's impending divorce circulates through New York society in whispered conversations and knowing glances, she hosts what will be one of her final major entertainments in the Petit Chateau. The gathering is carefully calibrated, not one of her massive balls, but a more intimate dinner for 60 guests, selected from among those families Alva believes will remain loyal despite the scandal, and those she wishes to test to see who will continue to accept her invitations as a soon-to-be divorced woman. The divorce proceedings are not yet public in the legal sense. The actual court filing will come in days. But in the closed world of New York's highest society, such secrets cannot be kept. Everyone knows that Willie K. has been living increasingly separate from Alva, that rumors of a liaison in Paris have been confirmed by multiple sources, that a legal separation or divorce is inevitable. Society columnists, constrained by the libel laws and social conventions that prevent explicit discussion of such matters, nonetheless hint at unsettling rumors and difficulties in certain prominent households while still dutifully describing Alva's table settings, floral arrangements, and the quality of the dinner she serves. The event tests loyalties and social calculations. Divorce in the 1890s carries enormous stigma, particularly for women. While men who divorce often suffer little social penalty and may remarry without serious difficulty, divorced women occupy an ambiguous and usually diminished social position. They are invited to fewer events, introduced less frequently to eligible men, sometimes quietly excluded from gatherings where their presence might make other guests uncomfortable. For someone like Alva, who has fought so hard to establish her social position, divorce threatens to undo years of strategic entertaining and careful cultivation of relationships. Yet Alva approaches the evening with characteristic determination. If she must be divorced, she will be divorced on her own terms, projecting not shame or defeat but dignified confidence that her position is secure regardless of marital status. The house is decorated with her usual attention to detail. Rare orchids and imported palms create an atmosphere of luxurious exoticism. Footmen in elaborate livery serve wine from Willie Kay's legendary cellars. The menu features delicacies prepared by the French chef whose services Alva will retain regardless of the divorce settlement. At the center of each table setting, flower arrangements that Alva has personally positioned that morning, not delegating the task to servants but performing it herself, adjusting each stem and bloom to create compositions that are simultaneously beautiful and somehow commanding, elegant reminders to each guest that they are dining in a house where excellence is expected and where the hostess remains firmly in control even as her marriage dissolves. Ledger books and society page coverage document the extravagance of these late entertainments, substantial sums spent on flowers, wine, specialized ingredients, and the theatrical production of hospitality that Alva has perfected. The spectacle enforces hierarchy while simultaneously masking the personal and financial instability that divorce represents. Guests admiring the table settings and complimenting the food may wonder privately about Alva's future, but in her presence they can only acknowledge her continued mastery of social performance. The narrator observes that in Gilded Age society, the boundary between hospitality and intimidation remains thin, often indistinguishable. The same flowers that grace tables, the same careful attention to guests' comfort and pleasure, the same elaborate ritual of formal dining can serve simultaneously as a generous welcome and as a demonstration of power, a reminder that the hostess commands resources and social skills sufficient to maintain her position regardless of personal circumstances. As guests depart that evening, leaving calling cards and murmuring appropriate thanks, none can be certain whether Alva will survive the coming scandal with her social position intact. Some perhaps privately hope she will not, seeing opportunity in her potential fall. Others calculate that her wealth and determination may prove sufficient to weather even divorce, and that maintaining connection with her remains strategically wise. The flower arrangements she has created, which will wilt and be discarded within days, nonetheless, leave an impression of control and confidence that may prove more durable than the blossoms themselves. What the guests do not yet know, what will only become clear in the months following the divorce, is that Alva has negotiated a settlement that will leave her not weakened but in some way strengthened. She will retain Marble House as her personal property, will secure substantial financial resources, and will gain freedom to pursue her own interests without needing to accommodate a husband's preferences or endure his infidelities. The divorce that seems like potential disaster is actually, in Alva's hands, becoming a strategic restructuring that will ultimately expand rather than contract her autonomy. By late 1894, as her marriage to Willie Kay deteriorated toward inevitable separation, Alva found herself traveling frequently between New York and Newport, maintaining social obligations in both places while navigating the increasingly public knowledge of her domestic difficulties. Contemporary letters and press reports, constrained by Victorian propriety from explicit discussion, but nonetheless conveying essential information through euphemism and implication, note Willie Kay's frequent absences and rumors of a liaison in Paris, whispers of a relationship with a woman identified only as a Parisian friend in the most discreet accounts. In private correspondence preserved in various archives, we can trace Alva's response to this humiliation. Rather than retreating from society or accepting the role of wronged wife with passive dignity, she continues her meticulous cultivation of both houses, planning future entertainments and reviewing every detail of household management with the same strategic intensity she has always brought to domestic display. If her marriage is failing, her houses will not. They will remain monuments to her taste and power, evidence that whatever personal difficulties she faces, her social position and aesthetic authority remain undiminished. It is during this period that observers most frequently recall Alva's famous maxim about marriage: first marry for money, then marry for love. Whether she actually articulated this philosophy at this particular moment, or whether it represents later reconstruction by those who knew her, the phrase captures something essential about her approach to the divorce. She married Willie Kay for his wealth, secured her social position through that marriage, and now, having achieved what the marriage could offer, she is prepared to end it and potentially pursue something closer to genuine companionship in a second union. The phrase also reveals the cold pragmatism with which women of Alva's generation and class sometimes approached matrimony. Marriages among the wealthy were alliances negotiated with attention to financial settlements, social position, and family strategy. Romantic love might or might not develop. If it did, that was fortunate. But if it did not, the marriage could still be considered successful if it achieved its practical objectives. Alva's willingness to divorce once the marriage had served its purpose and become actively unpleasant reflects this pragmatic understanding, even though divorce remains scandalous and risky. In the drawing rooms of Marble House and the Petit Chateau during these months of mounting crisis, Alva continues the private rituals that have always centered her, arranging flowers in vases throughout the houses, adjusting the position of furniture and objects to create pleasing visual compositions, planning menus and seating charts for dinners that will test which families remain loyal and which quietly withdraw their support as divorce approaches. The activity is partly aesthetic pleasure. She genuinely enjoys creating beautiful spaces, but it is also emotional management, a way of asserting control over her environment when her marriage has spiraled beyond control, a demonstration that she can still orchestrate perfection in the visible realm, even as the invisible emotional realm of her marriage collapses. The narrator reflects that refinement, honed over years and deployed strategically for social advancement, becomes in times of crisis a kind of armor, beautiful, heavy, protective of vulnerability, but also impossible to remove in public without risking exposure and defeat. Alva cannot allow herself to appear defeated or diminished, cannot display the hurt and anger she surely feels at her husband's infidelities and the social awkwardness of impending divorce. Instead, she must maintain perfect composure, hosting dinners and teas and receptions with the same grace and confidence she has always projected, using her mastery of social performance as a shield against the humiliations of a failed marriage. The woman who forced Mrs. Astor to acknowledge her social position, who built Marble House as a monument to her own ambition and will, now prepares to force a different kind of recognition from New York society and the legal system. Acknowledgement that a woman of her class and determination can survive and even triumph over divorce, that the scandal need not destroy her if she refuses to be destroyed, that the same strategic intelligence she deployed in social climbing can be redeployed in managing social crisis. As 1894 turns to 1895 and the divorce filing approaches, Alva's houses remain showcases of elegant order. Her entertainments continue to set standards for Newport and New York society, and her outward demeanor betrays no hint of distress or defeat. The performance is so successful that some observers will later claim they had no idea she was unhappy in her marriage, and that the divorce came as a complete surprise. The claim is perhaps willful blindness. The signs were there for those willing to see them, but it also testifies to the completeness of Alva's performance, her ability to weaponize beauty and grace, even in personal crises. On the evening of 19 August 1892, when Marble House officially opened to Newport society with the grand reception that forms our opening scene, the event represents the culmination of 4 years of planning and construction and decades of Alva's social ambition. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe a house costing $11 million to build and furnish, with approximately $7 million of that sum devoted to marble alone. Not marble facings or decorative elements, but massive structural marble creating a palace of stone unprecedented in American domestic architecture. The statistics, meticulously documented in architectural histories and Preservation Society records, convey scale, but not quite impact. 500,000 cubic feet of marble, brought from quarries in Europe and America and worked by specialized craftsmen. A gold ballroom with walls and ceiling covered in gold leaf. The room designed to glow under gaslight and candlelight with an almost celestial radiance. A dining room directly modeled on the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, its walls covered in pale pink marble, and its ceilings painted with allegorical scenes. Terraces and gardens designed by landscape architects to rival European estates. The National Park Service, which now helps oversee Marble House as a historic site, emphasizes in its interpretive materials how this single house helped transform Newport from a collection of Victorian wooden cottages into the stone palace landscape it would become by 1900. Marble House sparked competitive building among other wealthy families. Within a few years, the breakers would rise nearby as the Vanderbilt family's even larger cottage, and dozens of other elaborate stone mansions would line Bellevue Avenue and Ocean Drive, each trying to match or exceed the standards Marble House had established. But the house's impact on Newport architecture, however significant, matters less to Alva than its immediate impact on social hierarchies. That first summer season of 1892, she uses Marble House to reorder alliances with ruthless precision. Invitations for dinners, teas, balls, and receptions are distributed not randomly or according to friendship, but strategically, with careful attention to who is granted access to the magnificent rooms and who is excluded or relegated to less important gatherings. Family papers and social correspondence preserved in archives reveal some of this strategic calculation. Families who had slighted the Vanderbilts in earlier years find themselves excluded entirely, or invited only, to large impersonal receptions where they are treated politely but coldly. Those who had supported Alva's social rise received prominent invitations and honored placements at dinners. European visitors, particularly those with titles or significant aristocratic credentials, are cultivated with special attention, invited to intimate gatherings where they meet Alva's now adolescent daughter, Consuelo, beginning the process of creating connections that might eventually lead to the European marriage alliance Alva increasingly envisions. Before each dinner party, Alva walks the length of the long marble dining table, adjusting floral centerpieces with the same strategic attention she brings to every other aspect of hospitality. The flowers are not merely decorative but positional, visual markers that guide sight lines and shape the flow of conversation, ensuring that certain guests are emphasized and others subtly diminished by their placement. The arrangements are beautiful. Alva has excellent aesthetic taste, but they function as chess pieces in a social game she plays with mastery. Contemporary observers, writing in private correspondence or later memoirs, describe the effect of being entertained at Marble House that first season. The house is overwhelming, its marble surfaces and gilded rooms creating an atmosphere of almost royal magnificence. Guests feel simultaneously honored to be invited and subtly intimidated by the scale of display, aware that they are being entertained by someone whose wealth and determination have created something unprecedented. The experience is designed to produce exactly this combination of reactions. Gratitude for inclusion mixed with awareness that exclusion remains possible for those who displease the hostess. The narrator observes that while Marble House is officially described as a birthday present from Willie K. to Alva, and indeed, the house is given to her as personal property, which will prove crucial during the divorce. It functions less as a gift than as a fortress. It is Alva's stronghold, her monument, her weapon, a structure through which she can project power and command recognition regardless of whatever personal or marital difficulties may emerge in coming years. The marble is permanent in ways that marriage proves not to be, and Alva has ensured through careful legal arrangements that the house belongs to her, not to her husband or to their joint estate. When Marble House opens its doors to Newport society that August evening in 1892, some social doors quietly close for others, those who have failed to properly respect Alva's position, those who have bet against her rise, those who have treated her as nouveau riche rather than as the social power she has become. The Marble Palace is hospitality and intimidation simultaneously, beauty weaponized in service of social dominance. On the 5th March 1895, in a courtroom in Manhattan, a New York Supreme Court justice issued a ruling that sent shockwaves through American high society. He granted Alva Vanderbilt a divorce from William Kissam Vanderbilt on grounds of adultery, an almost unprecedented legal victory for a woman of her class and era. The New York Times, while maintaining the euphemistic discretion expected in coverage of such matters, reports that the settlement awards Alva substantial financial resources, ownership of both the Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue and Marble House in Newport, and custody of the couple's 3 children. Terms that leave her not impoverished or socially diminished, as divorced women often are, but financially independent and in control of the architectural monuments through which she has built her social position. The victory is extraordinary for several reasons. First, divorce itself remains deeply stigmatized in the 1890s, particularly among the wealthy elite who view permanent marriage as fundamental to social order and family stability. Second, successful divorce suits by women on grounds of adultery are rare. Courts generally require compelling evidence and view female plaintiffs with suspicion, often looking for ways to blame wives for their husband's infidelity or to minimize the grounds for dissolution. Third, settlements that leave women with substantial property and resources are unusual. Typically, husbands retain control of most assets, leaving divorced wives dependent on limited alimony or family support. That Alva secures such favorable terms reflects both the strength of her case — Willie Kay's adultery is apparently well documented and perhaps indefensible — and her own negotiating skill and determination. She has approached the divorce as she approaches everything, strategically, with clear objectives and willingness to fight for what she wants. The result is a legal arrangement that leaves her more autonomous than she was as a married woman, free to control her own houses and finances without needing a husband's approval or accommodation. Society commentators, writing in private correspondence and in the carefully coded language of newspaper columns, predict Alva's social ruin. Divorced women, they note, are typically excluded from the most respectable gatherings, viewed as potential threats to stable marriages, and relegated to secondary social status regardless of their wealth or former position. Some observers who have resented Alva's social success openly hope that divorce will finally bring her down and will force her to retreat from the prominence she has claimed. Instead, Alva consolidates her power. In the summer of 1895, she returned to Newport and opened Marble House for the season exactly as she had in previous years. The servants prepare the grand rooms with the same attention to detail. The floral arrangements are as spectacular as ever, and invitations go out to carefully selected guests. Alva presides over dinners and receptions with perfect composure, giving no hint of embarrassment or diminishment, daring society to exclude her, and making clear through her continued magnificence that she considers herself undiminished by divorce. Some families do withdraw their support, finding the scandal too great to overlook or using it as an excuse to distance themselves from someone they have always found too ambitious and aggressive. But others, perhaps impressed by Alva's courage in ending an unhappy marriage, perhaps calculating that her wealth and determination make her continued social power, likely maintain their connections and continue to accept her invitations and to invite her to their own gatherings. Gradually, over the summer season of 1895 and into the following years, it becomes clear that Alva has done the impossible. She has survived divorce with her social position not merely intact but in some way strengthened. She is now legally independent, controlling her own wealth and property, free to pursue her own interests without requiring a husband's consent or cooperation. The scandal that should have destroyed her has instead liberated her, and she has successfully defied the conventional wisdom that divorced women must accept social diminishment as the price of ending failed marriages. In the dining room of Marble House that summer, servants continue to prepare for entertainment exactly as they always have. But when Alva inspects the preparations, walking slowly around the long table and adjusting flower arrangements to achieve perfect effect, the gesture carries changed significance. These are no longer the centerpieces of a wife displaying her husband's wealth and her own taste. These are the arrangements of a woman displaying what the law has finally recognized as her own property, her own position, her own power. The narrator reflects that in a culture obsessively concerned with appearances and social propriety, Alva has used the most public scandal imaginable, divorce, to secure a more private autonomy, a legal independence that married women of her era almost never enjoy. The paradox is striking. The action that should have destroyed her social position has instead completed her transformation from ambitious social climber, dependent on her husband's wealth, to independent power in her own right, a woman whose position derives from her own resources and determination, rather than from marriage to a wealthy man. The marble remains where it was, solid and permanent, a monument now to its owner's autonomy, rather than to a marriage that could not contain or constrain her ambitions. In Alva's hands, even divorce becomes architecture, a restructuring of the social and legal foundations of her life, to create a more advantageous arrangement, demolishing what no longer serves and building something new on ground she now controls absolutely. On 11 January 1896, less than a year after her divorce from Willie Kay was finalized, Alva married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont at a ceremony at Grace Church in New York City. The speed of the remarriage startles some observers. The shortest respectable period of post-divorce waiting has barely elapsed. But those who know both Alva and Oliver well understand that this match represents something fundamentally different from her first marriage, a union based on genuine compatibility and affection, rather than purely financial strategy. Oliver Hazard, Perry Belmont, born into wealth himself as the son of the prominent financier August Belmont, is a longtime friend of the Vanderbilt family and someone Alva has known for years before her divorce. He is also the owner of Belcourt, another Richard Morris Hunt mansion just down Bellevue Avenue from Marble House in Newport, a somewhat smaller palace than Alva's own, built with Gothic details and including the unusual feature of a ground floor designed primarily as stables for Belmont's beloved horses, with the main living quarters occupying the upper floors. Newspaper coverage of the wedding notes the unconventional speed of Alva's remarriage, but also comments on the apparent genuine affection between the bride and groom, a warmth and compatibility that observers had not noted in Alva's first marriage to Willie Kay. Several accounts describe Oliver as intellectual and cultured, someone who shares Alva's interests in architecture, European culture, and social reform, making their relationship more of a partnership between equals than Alva's first marriage had been. Following the wedding, Alva makes a decision that surprises Newport society. She closes Marble House, the palace she fought to build and retain through divorce, and moves into Belcourt as Mrs. Oliver Belmont. The choice reflects her genuine attachment to Oliver. She's willing to live in his house rather than insisting he move into hers. But it also represents a strategic shift. As a married woman, even a previously divorced one, her social position is more secure in her husband's house than it would be in continuing to occupy her own palace, as if she remained single and independent. Yet Alva's architectural ambitions do not end with her move to Belcourt. In the years following her marriage to Oliver, she commissions a new project on Long Island, Brookholt, an estate that will function less as a traditional society showcase and more as an experimental farm and, eventually, as a school for women's agricultural and domestic education. Plans preserved in architectural archives show Alva's involvement in every detail of Brookholt's design, with particular attention to practical facilities for education and production, rather than purely aesthetic display. Photographs from the Belcourt years, roughly 1896 to 1908, show a subtle shift in how Alva presents herself. She still appears elegant and perfectly groomed, but there is a softening around the edges. She is photographed in garden hats and relatively simple day dresses, supervising flower beds and pergolas at Belcourt and Brookholt, her hands sometimes literally in the soil, rather than merely arranging cut flowers in vases. The images suggest someone discovering pleasures beyond social competition, exploring how land and buildings might be used for purposes other than intimidating rivals and impressing guests. Contemporary correspondence and later biographical accounts describe these years as perhaps the happiest of Alva's adult life. Oliver, by all accounts, treats her as an intellectual partner and companion, rather than as a decorative wife or social asset. They travel together to Europe, study architecture and gardens, discuss ideas about social reform and women's education that are beginning to reshape Alva's understanding of how her wealth and influence might be deployed. The marriage provides her with emotional satisfaction that her first marriage never approached, suggesting that her famous maxim about marrying first for money and then for love was not merely cynical calculation but accurate prediction. Brookholt's estate records, preserved in archives, show Alva's growing interest in practical questions about women's work, education, wages, and physical health, interests that will eventually lead her to become a major supporter of the women's suffrage movement. She establishes programs teaching young women agricultural skills and household management, experimenting with ideas about how education might expand rather than restrict women's opportunities, how knowledge might serve liberation rather than merely training for domestic service. The narrator observes that the woman who once used architecture primarily to conquer ballrooms and intimidate social rivals is beginning to explore how land and buildings might alter women's lives in more fundamental ways, how wealth might be deployed for purposes more substantive than social competition. The transformation is not complete. Alva remains fiercely competitive and conscious of her social position, but something is shifting, new possibilities opening, that her first marriage and her obsessive focus on social climbing had foreclosed. When Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont dies suddenly in June 1908, after only 12 years of marriage, Alva is genuinely devastated. The loss is not merely social or financial. She remains wealthy and socially prominent, but deeply personal. Accounts from family and friends describe her grief as profound and lasting, the sorrow of someone who has lost a true companion, the partner she had hoped to grow old with. Yet even in grief, Alva's response is characteristic. She does not retreat from public life, but instead channels her energy into new causes. The gardens she had tended with Oliver, the discussions about women's education and social reform they had shared, these now point her toward what will become the defining work of her final decades, her transformation from society hostess into suffrage activist, using the same strategic intelligence and relentless determination that had built her social position to fight for women's political rights. In the years immediately following Oliver Belmont's death in 1908, Alva's social calendar underwent a dramatic transformation, where once it was filled exclusively with balls, dinners, teas, and receptions designed to maintain and enhance her social position, it increasingly includes events of a different character: suffrage symposia, political planning meetings, fundraising campaigns for women's voting rights organizations. By 1909, she had founded the Political Equality League, sometimes called the EE Political Equality Association, providing substantial funding from her own fortune and using her organizational skills and social connections to advance the suffrage cause. The transformation is neither instantaneous nor complete. Alva does not abandon social life entirely or renounce her earlier concerns with status and position, but something fundamental has shifted in how she understands the purpose of her wealth and influence. Where once she used her resources primarily to compete with other wealthy women for social supremacy, she now begins using those same resources to challenge the legal and political structures that limit all women's power, regardless of their social class or individual circumstances. On a bright summer day in 1909, guests arrive at Marble House, which Alva has reopened after years of closure, not for a traditional ball or dinner, but for a suffrage symposium. The event, documented in newspapers and in records preserved at the New York Historical Society, represents a dramatic repurposing of the Grand Palace, Where once the Gold Ballroom hosted society dances and the dining room served elaborate meals celebrating Gilded Age wealth, now these same magnificent rooms host speakers advocating for women's voting rights, with banners reading "Votes for Women" hanging from marble walls. The menus, plates, and programs from these suffrage events preserved in museum collections show "Votes for Women" prominently displayed where once the Vanderbilt and Belmont crests had been emblazoned. The visual transformation is striking. The same attention to detail, the same insistence on elegant presentation, now deployed in service of political advocacy rather than social competition. Alva has not abandoned her aesthetic standards or her love of beautiful settings. She has redeployed them, using the power of elegant surroundings to lend dignity and seriousness to the suffrage cause. On the terrace overlooking the Atlantic, Alva speaks to assembled guests about women's legal dependence in marriage and work, drawing explicitly on her own experience navigating divorce and remarriage, her understanding that women without independent wealth have few protections if their marriages fail, or if their husbands prove abusive or negligent. Her arguments combine personal testimony with political analysis, making the case that voting rights are not abstract political principles but practical necessities for women's safety and autonomy. The same money that once poured into marble and orchids, into elaborate balls and competitive displays of wealth, now funds headquarters for suffrage organizations, finances speaking tours by activists like Alice Paul and Christabel Pankhurst, and underwrites publications and campaigns advocating for women's political rights. Financial records and organizational documents show the scale of Alva's contributions, substantial sums that provide crucial support to suffrage organizations that might otherwise lack resources, to maintain offices, pay staff, and conduct effective political organizing. Alva's flower arrangements remain impeccable. She still personally supervises the positioning of roses and other blooms throughout Marble House during suffrage events, but now they flank banners and podiums rather than serving as mere decoration for social gatherings. The aesthetic remains, but its purpose has been transformed. Beauty now serves politics. Elegance now frames arguments for fundamental social change rather than merely demonstrating the hostess's taste and wealth. Contemporary newspaper coverage of Alva's suffrage work often expresses surprise or even mockery. Society columns that once praised her balls now question whether a wealthy woman who has lived in palaces can genuinely care about the struggles of working women, whether her advocacy represents true conviction or merely a wealthy widow's search for new excitement. But Alva's response to such skepticism is characteristically forceful. She continues funding suffrage work, continues opening Marble House for political gatherings, continues using her social connections to bring prominent and wealthy people into contact with suffrage arguments and activists. The narrator reflects that grace has not disappeared from Alva's life, but has been redeployed as persuasion. The same skills she once used to arrange flowers and seating charts to achieve social dominance are now used to organize political events and fundraising campaigns. The same determination that built Marble House now builds political movements. The architectural monuments to her social ambition become stages for arguments about women's rights. The marble walls that once intimidated social rivals now echo with speeches about political equality. The transformation is not without contradictions. Alva remains concerned with social position and often patronizing toward working-class women even as she advocates for their voting rights. She expects deference and control in suffrage organizations just as she did in social gatherings, and her leadership style sometimes creates friction with other activists who resent her assumption of authority. The woman who forced Mrs. Astor to acknowledge her social position through an overwhelming display of wealth now attempts to force society to acknowledge women's right to vote through equally forceful deployment of resources and will. Yet, whatever her personal limitations and contradictions, Alva's contributions to the suffrage movement are substantial and consequential. Her money supports crucial organizational work. Her social connections bring wealthy and influential people into the suffrage coalition, and her willingness to use Marble House for political purposes helps legitimize suffrage advocacy as respectable rather than radical, making it easier for other wealthy women to support the cause without fearing social ostracism. the woman who once fought for a place on Mrs. Astor's guest list now fights for women's names on voter rolls, using the same strategic intelligence and ruthless determination that had served her social ambitions to pursue political goals that will benefit not just herself but women across American society, including those who will never enter the marble palaces where Alva had built her power. In 1913, 5 years into her intensive suffrage work, and several years before American women would actually secure the vote through the 19th Amendment, Alva built one of her most distinctive architectural statements, the Chinese tea house, on the grounds of Marble House. The structure, octagonal in plan and decorated with elaborate Chinese-inspired details, is ostensibly a garden folly in the tradition of European estate architecture, but its true purpose is explicitly political. It is designed as a venue for suffrage teas and planning meetings, a space where political organizing can be conducted in a setting that combines elegance with a hint of exoticism and international sophistication. The inspiration for the tea house, according to Alva's own statements preserved in contemporary accounts, comes from reports that Chinese women have secured voting rights in their country, a claim that reflects more enthusiasm than accurate understanding of Chinese political developments, but that nonetheless suggests Alva's desire to connect American suffrage work to international movements for women's rights. The building's Chinese architectural references make this connection explicit, positioning American suffragists as part of a global transformation in women's political status. The tea house itself, now preserved as part of the Marble House Museum site and described in National Park Service and Preservation Society materials, features remarkable details that combine aesthetic pleasure with practical function. Miniature railroad tracks circle the interior at table height, with small rail cars that carry tea and refreshments to guests, a technological novelty that delights visitors while also subtly reminding them of Vanderbilt Railroad wealth, the fortune that makes such architectural experiments possible. On 26 July 1914, a significant suffrage gathering took place at the Chinese tea house when Alice Paul, one of the most radical and effective American suffrage leaders, addresses assembled activists and supporters. Paul's presence at Marble House represents the convergence of Alva's wealth and social connections with the more militant wing of the suffrage movement. The activists willing to use confrontational tactics, including demonstrations, pickets, and civil disobedience to force political change. The event, documented in Rhode Island newspapers and in suffrage organization records, shows how Alva uses Marble House's glamour and her own social position to attract attention to suffrage arguments. Reporters who might not cover a suffrage meeting in a modest hall or office are drawn to Marble House by the novelty of seeing political activism conducted in such magnificent surroundings, by the incongruity of radical speakers addressing audiences beneath gold-leaf ceilings and surrounded by marble columns. The setting itself becomes part of the message. If women wealthy enough to live in palaces are demanding the vote, the argument runs, then the cause must be serious and respectable, worthy of attention, even from those who might otherwise dismiss women's rights advocacy as fringe radicalism. By the 1920s, after the 19th Amendment had been ratified and American women had secured voting rights, Alva increasingly settled in Paris and at the Château d'Augerville, a French estate she had acquired. She continues her advocacy work, now focusing more on international women's rights and on economic questions, including equal pay. But she visits the United States less frequently, spending more of her time in France among the expatriate American community and European social and political circles. She died in Paris on 26 January 1933 at age 80, having lived long enough to see women vote in multiple American elections, to witness significant changes in women's legal status and social positions, to know that her suffrage work has contributed to real political transformation. Obituaries in American newspapers, preserved in archival collections, memorialize her as both society leader and suffrage activist, recognizing the dual nature of her public life without quite knowing how to reconcile the woman who built marble palaces with the woman who fought for voting rights. Today, visitors to Marble House walk through the grand rooms on guided tours, their progress carefully controlled by velvet ropes that separate the path visitors may take from the historic spaces they may observe but not enter. Display cases show original china and crystal, period furniture arranged as it might have been during Alva's lifetime, and meticulously recreated floral arrangements. Museum staff regularly replace flowers to maintain period appropriate displays, continuing the tradition of perfect arrangements that Alva herself had insisted upon. But other displays show a different side of Alva's legacy. Suffrage pamphlets and posters that she funded and distributed, photographs of suffrage gatherings at Marble House, replicas of the Votes for Women china used at political events, copies of speeches and writings in which Alva argued for women's political equality. The house now tells both stories: the Gilded Age social competition and the Progressive Era political activism, leaving visitors to reconcile these seemingly contradictory aspects of a single complex life. The narrator observes that the architecture of Alva's privilege remains physically intact. Marble House stands solid on its marble foundations. The Chinese tea house still perches in the gardens overlooking the ocean, but its meaning has shifted dramatically with the causes Alva attached to it in her later decades. Rooms built to intimidate social rivals and demonstrate overwhelming wealth became spaces where political movements organized and radical ideas found respectable platforms. The marble that was meant to enforce social hierarchies eventually housed arguments for their dismantling, or at least for their transformation to include women's voices and votes. What endures is neither pure triumph nor simple condemnation, but something more complicated: evidence of how one woman used the tools of her class and era: wealth, social connections, architectural display, aesthetic sophistication, first to climb social ladders and then, eventually, to challenge some of the structures that had made those ladders necessary, that had limited women's power to the domestic and social realms where Alva had initially been forced to exercise her considerable abilities. In a quiet upper gallery at Marble House today, among the permanent exhibits that interpret Alva Vanderbilt Belmont's life for contemporary visitors, a photograph shows her seated in a high-backed chair during her later years. Her hands are folded in her lap in the composed pose expected of women of her generation and class. On a small table beside her chair, a crystal vase holds a carefully arranged spray of roses. Whether the flowers were actually present when the photograph was taken, or added later through darkroom technique, is impossible to determine, but their inclusion is fitting, given Alva's lifelong attention to floral arrangements as elements of domestic display. The marble walls visible behind her in the photograph are unchanged from the day they were installed in the early 1890s. Stone is permanent in ways that human lives and social movements are not. But the interpretation of those walls, the meaning visitors today take from them, has moved far beyond what Alva might have imagined when she first commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to create her marble palace. The house that was built to enforce her position at the apex of Gilded Age society is now interpreted primarily as a document of that society's inequalities and excesses, and as the site where its owner eventually challenged some of those structures by supporting suffrage and other reform causes. Another display case in the museum holds suffrage pamphlets printed with Alva's money, their paper yellowed now and protected behind UV filtering glass. Beside them sits a place card from an early 20th century suffrage tea, Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont, engraved in elegant script, the same careful lettering that once appeared on social invitations to Gilded Age balls, now marking her place at a political gathering, advocating for fundamental social change. On a table near the window, museum staff have placed a vase of fresh roses, renewed each week as part of the site's maintenance and interpretation. The flowers are not period pieces. These specific blooms were cut yesterday or the day before, not in 1892 or 1914, but they evoke the arrangements Alva herself would have created and supervised, continuing a ritual of domestic beauty that she practiced throughout her life, even as its purposes and contexts shifted dramatically. It is the same gesture we saw in our opening scene on that August evening in 1892. A woman now represented only by photographs and objects, her physical presence long vanished, framed by flowers in a carefully constructed architectural space. Once, those arrangements enforced social hierarchy. demonstrating the hostess's taste and wealth while subtly positioning guests in relations of dominance and subordination. Later, the same attention to beautiful floral displays adorned political protests and suffrage gatherings, lending elegance and respectability to radical arguments about women's rights. No single museum placard or interpretive text can fully explain that transformation, can capture the complexity of a woman who used the constraints of her gender and era as tools for accumulating power, who weaponized beauty and domestic skills in pursuit first of social dominance and later of political change, who remained in many ways deeply conservative, even as she fought for reforms that threatened existing social structures. The marble surrounding today's visitors remains cool to the touch, its surface polished to the same high gloss Alva would have demanded, its mass projecting the same sense of permanence and solidity that made it such an effective architectural choice for someone determined to establish her position beyond question. The rooms are still preserved now by museum protocols rather than by servants following a demanding mistress's instructions. And the flowers wait in their vase, beautiful, fresh, carefully arranged, an enduring reminder that in Alva Vanderbilt Belmont's world, beauty was never merely decoration, never only aesthetic pleasure, but always and fundamentally a form of power. Whether that power served primarily Alva's personal ambitions or contributed meaningfully to broader social progress remains a question that admits no simple answer. She built monuments to her own ego and used them eventually to house movements for change. She enforced hierarchies of class and wealth even as she challenged hierarchies of gender. She demanded deference and control while arguing that women should have greater autonomy. She lived in marble palaces while funding work that would ultimately help dismantle the social structures that had made such palaces meaningful. The contradictions cannot be resolved and perhaps should not be. They are part of the historical record, part of what makes Alva's life interesting and significant rather than merely an example of Gilded Age excess or progressive era reform. She contains multitudes, as all humans do, but her wealth and determination gave her the resources to enact those contradictions on a grand scale, to build them in marble and gold leaf, to arrange them like flowers in magnificent vases for the world to observe and interpret. The visitor today walking through Marble House on the designated path, prevented by velvet ropes from touching the furniture or entering the private spaces, experiences the house as Alva's guests once did, as spectators of carefully curated magnificence, witnesses to wealth transformed into architecture and beauty weaponized in service of power. But they also encounter what Alva's social guests could not have fully anticipated, evidence that the same house, the same wealth, the same determination that had enforced social hierarchies could also, in different hands and with different purposes, or in the same hands redirected toward new purposes, provide platforms for challenging those hierarchies, for imagining and working toward different arrangements of power and possibility. The marble is cool, the room is still. The flowers wait in their vase, and Alva Vanderbilt Belmont remains, in death as in life, impossible to reduce to simple judgment or single narrative. A woman who learned early that beauty and grace could be wielded as weapons, and who spent her life exploring what those weapons might accomplish, for good and for ill, in a world that gave women few other tools with which to build power.